Most of the presentations you're going to hear in the conference are about specific pieces of work, of research, advancing knowledge in policing, which is so important. In fact, it's one of the objectives of the society, communicating and using the best evidence. But my presentation is more about not the what of EBP, but the how of EBP. And I'm going to share with you some of my insights into how you can apply evidence-based policing in a practical way on the ground, and how policing more generally might continue to build this capability. So to start with, I want to share with you something a little bit abstract and non-police related. The Royal Society in the UK is a fellowship of the world's most eminent scientists, and their motto is nullus in verba, which simply means take nobody's word for it. And that motto is an expression of the determination of the fellows to withstand the domination of authority and to verify all statements by an appeal to facts as determined by evidence. And I share that with you as a relevant lead into my presentation on EBP because I think it shares a very similar philosophy. But the movement towards EBP and the application of science and research to policing has not historically been a smooth path. But nor was the path smooth for nurses, who half a century ago were seen as bed changers, or for ambulance officers, who were seen as stretcher carriers. And when you think about those professions and what actually makes those professions professional, it's the evidence upon which their craft is based. So where are we at in policing? A cynical view may suggest that, put simply, police don't like research. They don't particularly engage with it, and they find it irrelevant to practice. It's fair to say that police are pragmatic and often reject the theoretical for the practical. And the pace at which police are required to respond is often perceived to be inconsistent with research and the demands of the authorising environment in which we operate. Police take a reactive approach to problem solving and move very quickly from problem definition to solution, with greater emphasis on responding and with less emphasis on the rigour or analysis of the outcome. Professor Jerry Ratcliffe, former police officer from Temple University, refers to it as under 10 football, where everyone jumps on the ball until it's kicked down the field, and then we do it all over again. Professor Gloria Laycock from University College London refers to police simply as Geronimo, because we jump in and solve problems. So what is the police perception of academics? One view is they are entirely focused on analysis, data and publications. They're too slow for our pace. Everything's caveated. And when you ask for a straight answer, they sort of say, well, it's a bit complicated. This is not entirely the researcher's fault. Police have traditionally been poor consumers and generators of research, and historically, police have not owned their science, nor developed a culture that values research. But it's not all doom and gloom. EBP is shifting that relationship, and a kind of view would be there's a growing movement towards evidence-based policing. And the evidence and innovation presented at this conference is a reflection of that change. For example, the Society has 4,000 members and growing. The conference has attracted over 1,700 registrations. And from an international perspective, societies also exist in the UK, being the founding society, Canada and the USA. And as mentioned, New Zealand Police have established the Evidence-Based Policing Centre and are leading globally in this space. The UK College of Policing is driving evidence-based policing across constabularies, and there is work underway by the University of Queensland, being supported by the Society and many police agencies, to develop a global policing database with thousands of studies collated and categorised for the benefit of police. So things are looking up, and you are a part of the EBP movement by being here today. So let's start with EBP as a concept. Slide 2, Professor Lawrence Sherman, acknowledged as one of the top criminologists in the world and founder of evidence-based policing, would say, Of all the ideas in policing, one stands out as the most powerful force for change. Police practice should be based on scientific evidence about what works, and in contrast to making decisions on assumptions, tradition, or convention, an evidence-based approach tests a hypothesis with empirical research findings. But it's not a model where researchers work on policing from the outside, or where we sit back and let academics take the lead. EBP is a practitioner-led research model by police, for police, and within police. And it sees police use their experience and supported by academia to design trials, to use big data analysis, to target and identify concentrations of harm and offending, to test policing practices and ultimately add to the body of knowledge of policing. Now, some might suggest that EBP is just the next fad and will come and go. We've had intelligence-led policing, community-led policing, problem-oriented policing. I couldn't disagree more. Testing what works, using evidence, will never go out of fashion. And I don't see medicine, pharmacology, epidemiology, or social services getting bored anytime soon with evidence-based practice. And in the context of community safety, where over $12 billion of public money is spent on policing in this country, there is a very strong case for the investment and development of evidence-based policing in the future. Rather than being the new fad, as Professor Jerry Ratcliffe suggests, it could be that EBP is an overarching approach, which is harm-focused, intelligence-led, problem-oriented, and evidence-based. So slide 3, in a practical sense, I want to share with you some of the EBP work that's underway in Victoria. These trials pose some pretty fundamental questions. During a pandemic lockdown, how can police in their day-to-day police-citizen interactions build trust with the public rather than erode confidence? Post-lockdown, how can police prevent offenders resuming a path to serious public violence? How can police, by their presence, stop crime before it happens and create a free bonus of crime prevention after they leave? And how can we nudge offenders to appear in court and reduce arrests? So slide 4, let's kick off with trial number 1, police legitimacy, using procedural justice to increase confidence in policing. Now, Victoria has endured and is enduring at present the longest lockdown in the world, over 200 days, and indeed, this will be escalated at midnight tonight to a curfew. Police have significant powers to demand from anyone in society. Where are you going? Where do you live? Why aren't you wearing a mask? How far are you from home? Why are you on the street at this time? These are unique intrusions into the freedoms that citizens enjoy in society, and police and how police apply the application of enforcement is critical. So how should police go about that task? We know that you can't take community trust for granted. You need to earn it, preserve it, and not erode it. The UK adopted the 4 E's: engage, encourage, explain, and then enforce. And as a general position in Victoria, we have sought to only proceed against blatant and obvious breaches of health directions. But whatever way you try and apply it, it's not easy for frontline officers against a backdrop of changing restrictions and community attitudes. So we looked at the evidence around trust and confidence, or what's referred to as police legitimacy. And we were guided by a worldwide systematic review of the best evidence from the Campbell collaboration. They synthesise only the highest quality studies to determine if specific police strategies are effective. And I rang Professor Lorraine Mazerol and Sarah Bennett from the University of Queensland, and I asked, how can we use the evidence of what works around police legitimacy and apply it to pandemic policing? So the evidence informed our approach and was based on the following principles. Effective policing requires voluntary public cooperation. Citizens are more likely to cooperate when they view the police as legitimate, and that community trust and confidence in police, along with the willingness of the public to follow police directions, can actually be enhanced through everyday police-citizen encounters by using the pillars of procedural justice. And you'll hear more about procedural justice from Professor Tom Tyler next. So the pillars of procedural justice are basically this: showing respect, allowing people to speak, giving voice, being neutral, and showing trustworthy motives. So how do we use those pillars in a practical way in the field, doing COVID compliance during a lockdown? Slide 6. So firstly, we came from the fundamental position that every police citizen encounter is an opportunity to leave a good impression. So with the help of UQ, we developed PACT, P-A-C-T, an overarching structure to guide police in the field. How do we implement PACT? So in the Southern Metro region of Melbourne, half our police geographically who were performing COVID compliance, what we call Operation Sentinel, were trained to use PACT. The other half went about COVID compliance in the usual manner. And the training went like this: when you engage with the community, when you check someone about COVID compliance, use PACT to guide your language, okay? So explain your purpose, something like police are checking thousands of people to keep the community safe and stop the spread of the virus. Acknowledgement, allow them to have their say. People feel they're treated more fairly when they can have their say. Be neutral, don't assume they're doing anything wrong. Show empathy, acknowledging the challenging circumstances that everyone is dealing with. Cooperation, seek and encourage their cooperation. Something like, it's really important that we all do the right thing. And then finally, bookend that interaction with a thank you. Something as simple as, please keep yourself and your family safe. It's really important. And this is important because it goes to showing trustworthy motives and that police actually cared. And then we'd ask them to do a community survey via a QR code. But just before I tell you about the responses to that survey, I just want to quickly tell you who the respondents were. Basically, 2 out of 3 spoke a language other than English and half were born overseas. So it's a very good cross-section of our multicultural societies. So what did they say? Slide 7. So when asked, what's the main reason you think police are conducting checks? The public did perceive that the police role was primarily about encouraging the public to follow health directives. They didn't just cynically see it as giving out fines. They saw it for its intended purpose. And that's a tick for legitimacy. Then we asked, what police powers do you support or oppose? And the police powers most supported was setting up checkpoints during a lockdown. In other words, stopping the movement of people between high risk and low risk geographical areas. And that's interesting because the public values the restriction of movement, particularly in our case at the time where we had a ring of steel around the Metro Melbourne to separate rural areas. And slide 9, here's the important slide, the results. Now, this slide goes directly to the context of legitimacy. Now, remember, this is the results of the treatment group, the responses made by the public when they interacted with the trained officers. The public rated the response 1, strongly disagree, up to 5, strongly agree. Now, here's the question. So thinking about the interaction with police, rate the following. The police treated me fairly. They were polite. They were trustworthy. They explained the interaction. They treated me with respect. They gave me an opportunity to speak. They cared about my safety and they listened to me. And as you can see, they're all very positive responses to all of those aspects, which is really pleasing. So here's the most important question. How do those results compare to the public responses for the officers who were not trained? Because that's what makes this an evidence-based trial. We're testing what works, right? Unfortunately, I can't tell you the answer. It was certainly our intention and design of the trial to answer that. But when we got our first survey numbers back in after a month, it was clear the officers in the untrained group were not handing out the cards. The trained officers were. That's fine. It's a live operational trial. We were going to nudge them along to hand out the cards. But at the same time, fortunately for Victoria, unfortunately for the trial, this coincided with lockdown being lifted and those duties ceased. So this trial gives me an opportunity to share with you my first practical insight about doing evidence-based work. Implementation is challenging. particularly in an operational setting, let alone in a changing environment in the midst of a crisis where everyone's focused on just responding. And it's called tracking. It's one of the three T's of evidence-based policing. But let me ask you this. When the dust settles on the pandemic, this question remains really important, and we need to be able to answer it. How can police build legitimacy in a crisis enforcement situation and come out the other side stronger in the eyes of the public and at the same time more effective in their purpose? We have cast light on that question, but we haven't completely tested the hypothesis. And if you find yourself shifting in your chair a little bit and wanting to know the answer, what you're really wanting is an evidence-based policing approach that tests policing strategies to determine if they work. So we'll go to trial number 2, using behavioural science to reduce failure to appear at court. Capacity to hear cases basically stall. As a result, there's a huge backlog of cases that will take years to clear. In fact, our local prosecutor's office has literally run out of space to store the briefs. The consequence is that accused become disengaged with the court process and don't turn up, and we see an increase in warrants. And that's not desirable for police because it takes considerable time to execute warrants. It's not desirable for the courts because they're under extreme pressure, and it's certainly not desirable for an accused because a failure to appear means you're on a path to remand. So with the assistance of the Behavioural Insights team in Victoria, we looked at the best evidence, in particular a New York trial that tested whether simplified information reduced warrants and therefore arrests. So how can behavioural science help us? It can make it short and simple, provide certainty about the obligations. It can emphasise the cost of not taking action really clearly. And here's the important one, it can limit the content and technical garb that is often associated with court processes. And it can also provide direct access to information. So here's the current summons. It's 7 pages, 2,200 words. In fact, it's misleading because it doesn't clearly tell the accused about what they need to do in the context of avoiding a warrant. And this is on top of a whole lot of other information they're currently getting about virtual appearances, etc. So here's the new form, the key information sheet, less than 100 words. It tells them exactly when and where. It also says if you don't turn up, a warrant may be issued very clearly. And it has, here's the important one, it has direct QR codes to Victoria Legal Aid, Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service and the courts to take people to the information that they need. So in addition to getting the summons information sheet, they're also getting a text and an email. And the trial in New York showed that reduced warrants by 1/3. So does it work in this situation? What we're implementing this in Southern Metro region at 18 stations for adult offenders. And we're going to match those 18 stations to 18 stations in other regions. It's called a matched pair design. And we're going to compare the groups to see if it reduces warrants and reduces arrests and calculate the savings for police and the courts. But the insight I want to share with you that's relevant to this trial and others is this. Theory and published studies matter. As police, we need to engage with theory more than we do because there's great value in that knowledge, and in particular criminological theory. We teach police very proficiently how to use force against other human beings, but we don't teach police how to reduce crime. And high quality trials can be very valuable for police, particularly in the context of replication. So what can you do as a police officer in this space? What I would say is this: go to Google, type in Google Scholar, and it will take you to a whole different search engine, and then type in any policing challenge that you like. And you'll be surprised at some of the studies that you will find that hopefully will assist you in your work. So trial number 3, the criminology of place, deploying police to persistent crime locations to prevent crime. This is not about the who done it, it's about the where done it. And when you think about how police define hotspots, the unit of analysis tends to be large geographical areas. And whether it's called a precinct or a high-risk location, it seems to be the convention in policing that we think about hotspots as being large areas. And we often use thermal density maps, as you can see. So we've worked with our intelligence command to do some unique geospatial analysis that challenges that assumption. Rather than analysing large geographical areas, we have analysed half of Melbourne to micro locations. Every street broken down into these small street segments. And there are 36,000 micro street locations in Southern Metro region. On average, these segments are 150 metres long. And we have analysed all the crime and all the calls for assistance over a year. There are 42,000 crimes over a 12-month non-COVID period, and there's 105,000 calls over that same period. So here's the question. How concentrated is crime to these micro locations? And here's the answer to that. 1% of those 36,000 street segments, 1%, 360, accounts for a quarter of all crime. And less than 5% of those street segments account for half of all crimes. And it's very similar for CAD, calls for assistance. So crime and CAD are incredibly concentrated to a very small proportion of micro locations. And if you want an indication of how important these street segments are, consider this. Over COVID and lockdowns, crime dropped around 20% or more, depending on which crime category you're looking at. Of the entire drop in crime in Victoria, nearly 40% of that drop occurred in just the top 200 micro locations. So that shows you the concentration of crime to place. So what other research questions does it pose? Well, why does crime occur in these locations in the first place? Well, it occurs because the ingredients for crime exist in these locations. When those ingredients come together in time and place, crime occurs. What proportion of locations are cold spots? This is really interesting. 63% of those street segments had zero crime in 12 months, and 81% of those street segments had one crime or less. So why would I send a police car down those streets when they basically are free from crime? Are these locations stable? And we looked at the frequency of crime over the year, and yes, they are stable. It occurs consistently over the year. How variable is the spatial distribution? Do they all happen in the one spot? And answering that simply is there are good streets in bad neighbourhoods and there are bad streets in good neighbourhoods, and they do not all collect in the one spot. In fact, some of our highest crime streets connect with the street with zero crime, which means we need to be more surgically precise.
Kia ora, Dave. Hopefully we'll hear more from Dave very soon. Just a couple of technical issues there. So we'll hopefully bring Dave back live to you on the conference very soon and hear more from him. He certainly has a lot more to offer. We may bring Mark in just to answer a couple of questions. Don't forget, you can also submit your questions as a part of the Q&A. I know Dave said that there might not be time given the length of his presentation, but we still would like to see you posting questions for the Q&A forum. So you can do that via the Q&A facility and post those questions to us. Mark is joining me now. Thank you again, Mark, for joining us. Look, Dave's made a couple of important points already. I just get you to reflect on some of those that you've heard so far and make some comments of those, if that's okay.
Well, Dave's talked quite a lot, I think, about what the barriers to the implementation of evidence-based policing are. And as somebody that's been involved in this field probably for 15 or 20 years, I think we've got a challenge because policing is very action-orientated and we like to get stuff done. Evidence-based policing requires, us to probably sit, think, problem solve, and just work on a range of different ways in which we might bring data, insights and analysis to a problem. Fundamentally, it requires strong leadership, in my opinion, and police organisations require leadership from the top so that decision makers are prepared to value the outputs of an evidence-based policing approach, that we change our systems and structures in order to support that kind of approach. And critically, you need to get the buy-in from your staff that understand the value of this approach. So one of the things that we did in New Zealand Police when we were rolling out our evidence-based policing centre was we thought carefully about how we could make it relevant to frontline staff. So all New Zealand Police frontline staff have access to a mobile phone, an iPhone. We created an application which we call Checkpoint. This allows frontline staff to get access to consumable, useful information, and we branded that as evidence-based policing. And what that did really was it brought frontline staff into the concepts of evidence-based policing so that they could see the value to themselves in an operational policing sense.
And is it seeing the value that entrenched the use of the app and therefore gave full effect to the overall program of evidence-based policing that you're doing now?
So I think it was at various levels. I think we exist to deliver policing services to the community. That's done by officers in the field. They often haven't got the time to think through some of the things that we're talking about at this conference, but they deliver that service, and it's quite important that they feel connected to it. And then we've got people that, as Dave talked about, design experiments, run experiments, and use those insights to direct the way we deploy resources.
Right, another question, and please keep those questions coming in. Really thank you for posting the questions to us. Should police services make EBP and problem solving a critical part of a police officer and staff learning and continuous professional development from day one? Mark, your thoughts?
So what's interesting, we teach recruits that want to join the police and at the police college lots of things, about legislation, how to keep themselves safe, which is a fundamentally important point. We talk to them very little about crime and how to solve crime, which I think is always slightly ironic, given that the police service, is generally regarded as the crime-fighting tool for, society. So I think that there's a big opportunity for us to help educate new police officers about some of the principles. Many of them today, most of them in fact, have a degree. Many of them have a master's degree before they join policing. We have a workforce that is really, I think, up for conversations about evidence, data and insights. So I think absolutely there's a real opportunity, I think, to embed some of these concepts across the wider work of policing. And I would say that as we talk increasingly about policing by consent and the legitimacy of policing, understanding the evidence base is increasingly important, I think, to the delivery of day-to-day policing services everywhere, I think.
We are trying to get Dave Cowan back on the line. So again, bear with us as we re-establish the link with Dave. We hope to get Dave very soon. I think Dave might be ready now, actually, for us. So let's take you back now to Dave Cowan. Again, apologies, Dave, for those technical issues, but we'll hand back to you now.
It wasn't your fault. It was entirely mine. But we're back on track, and sorry about that. My apologies, everyone. Let's skip to slide 21, which is trial number 4 that I wanted to talk to you about. I've hit you up for hotspots, but in a nutshell, we're going to test that hotspot trial by deploying police to those micro locations and really see if it reduces crime. So if you move to the next one, next slide, and we're going to give the officers the information they need in the field so that they can understand what on their mobile devices, what the policing challenges are of those locations. Next slide, thanks. So trial number 4, reducing serious public violence, okay? So during COVID, as I've said, crime dropped, including crimes against the person, in particular, serious violence in public. So why did it drop? Well, basically, the essential ingredients for crime changed. And in order for crime to occur, you need a vulnerable victim, you need a motivated offender, and you need a lack of guardianship. And when those three things come together in time and place, you have the ingredients for crime. But lockdown changed those ingredients. And in many cases, there weren't any victims or even offenders on the street. So the question is, how can we use the unique set of circumstances that present with us to reduce the springback of crime? So slide 24. So the first thing we had to do was identify the offenders most at risk of committing serious public violence. And we identified 500 offenders with multiple incidents of serious public violence over the preceding 3 years for those offences. And as you can see, very serious offences. And when we analysed it further, those offenders were not specialists in serious violence. In actual fact, they were generalists in their offending, with most of them having committed 3.5 other crimes over the same period in addition to the public violence. So what was the strategy? Now we've identified them. Well, we used the best evidence and we went to the Campbell Collaboration Systematic Review of Focused Deterrence, where they gathered up all the studies in the world and just used the highest quality studies to find that focused deterrence was moderately effective at reducing reoffending. And what do we want to do with this strategy? We want to increase that person of interest's perception of risk around getting caught, basically their apprehension risks. We want them to know that they are likely to be caught if they continue to commit crime. We want to reduce their perception that they're just anonymously going about committing crime. They are on the police radar and they need to know there are risks of future offending. We also wanted to activate the social control mechanisms around them, their loved ones, their partners, their parents when we talk to them. We wanted to give them a nudge outside a time of arrest, and it was a consent-based, respectful process. Put simply, it was a carrot and stick approach. So we also provided them with a referral if they were willing to engage with us across 15 pathways. But we also gave them a desistance letter, which again, we developed with the Behavioural Insights team. So before you ask the question, did it work? You need to ask a more fundamental question. Did we do what we said we were going to do? Did we implement it? And it's called tracking. So every visit police made, they had to do a return. And this was really important as we could enter all that data in and analyse it to see how we went at implementing the trial. We actioned 86%. We had a contact rate of nearly 60% of the 500. Interestingly, of the people we spoke to, the officers rated the interaction as meaningful in over 50% of the engagements. 23% declined to engage with us, but despite declining to engage with us, over 90% accepted the desistance letter. And when the door closed to the house, something else went on with that letter. I expect it ended up in the bin at some point, but I think there would have been some conversations with family members. Are you in trouble again, etc., and possibly that had some other impact. So in addition to implementation data, we then did a debrief with the detectives and used specialist officers to get some qualitative insights into implementing a trial of this nature. So now we get to, did it work? Okay. Did it prevent reoffending? Did it reduce violence on our streets? Or did it make it worse? So this is where an evidence-based testing comes in. And you remember how I said there were 500 POIs? That's not exactly correct. There was 1,000. And in order to test it, we randomly selected them into two groups, a treatment group and a control group. So now we can compare the reoffending rates of the two groups. And this is really important in the context of evidence-based policing because this is empirically testing a police strategy to determine if it works. And I'll come back to that point when I make my final summation. So these are some of the preliminary results. 6 months in, and we ideally want to analyse this 12 months in, but they give us some indication. So the red line is the offenders who got the visit, and the blue line is the control group. They didn't get a visit. So did the intervention reduce the rate of offending for all offences? You can see there from the date we started on slide 28, from the date we started, there seems to be some separation in a reduction in the rate of reoffending. Slide 29, when you look at just those serious violent offences and days to committing further offences, it also appears that there is a reduction in the rate of recidivism for serious violent offenders. Slide 30, and then of the people we spoke to, here's some interesting questions. Were younger or older offenders more responsive to the treatment? And this is interesting because it goes against some of the theory. It seems that older offenders seem to be more responsive than young offenders, possibly suggesting the lack of maturity in younger offenders, not understanding the risk. Slide 31, were networked offenders, people with more co-offenders in their history, more or less responsive? And this is interesting too, because offenders with more co-offenders over the preceding 3 years recidivated more than the offenders with less co-offenders in their history, which is probably what you'd think, but at least we have the evidence to show that. And finally, did reductions in repeat offending diffuse to their co-offenders? And this is really interesting. Nearly 200 of the 500 offenders for serious public violence were connected through a single network. And what we're going to do is we're going to analyse, just as Barak Ariel analysed in his paper, I heard it through the grapevine, we're going to analyse to see if the crime prevention benefit then flowed on to the network of their co-offenders to see if there was a reduction as in the co-offenders. So my final insights, I want to make some important points. I think that the trial I just spoke about, along with the others I've shared, provide a good opportunity to make these final observations on EBP. Firstly, EBP embraces any research methodology appropriate to the challenge, such as the vast array of research presented at this conference. Put simply, if it adds to the knowledge of policing and has rigour, it falls under the banner of EBP. But at the core of evidence-based policing is what works research and testing. Slide 33. So I just want to share this slide with you from Professor Jerry Ratcliffe, and it's an evidence hierarchy, and I think it can be quite helpful for police. And when you think about how police respond to crime issues and then try and assess the effectiveness of that response, typically policing is dominated by before and after comparisons, and they're down on level 2 of this chart, okay? So this is how it usually goes. Crime goes up. We don't have the luxury of waiting. We need to do something, and then we want some indication after that to see whether it worked. So we look to see whether crime had dropped, and that's fair enough. But police are also astute enough to know that the before and after approach to assessing the impact of their strategy has major limitations. Because the conversation often goes like this: oh, that was winter, this is summer. Oh, that was lockdown, this is pre-lockdown. That was during the term, this is school holidays. But here's another limitation to that approach. When we often react, a crime is abnormally high. And if you look to other periods where that crime was abnormally high, usually the crime trend comes back to the average. And a statistician or criminologist would call it regression to the mean. But it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, oh, it worked. But the real question is, did it? So the main point I'm making is that it's very hard to say with certainty that your intervention caused that result. With evidence-based policing, you'll hear this term random or randomisation. So what does randomisation do? And put simply, it creates two groups that are very similar or equivalent. So with the serious violence trial I spoke about previously, before we even started implementing the strategy, we looked at the characteristics of the two groups that we'd randomly selected into two groups. And here's how this shows the similarity of the groups. The gender was the same, 80% males, 20% female. The age distribution, half are under 24, half are over under 24. And importantly, the repeat offending and recidivism rates were the same in both groups. So the magic of randomisation creates two largely equivalent groups. Or put another way, quite simply, it creates a fair baseline of comparison. So basically, an evidence-based trial allows you to say with a high degree of certainty, just like in a medical trial, that any change between the two groups can be attributed to your strategy and not to chance or other circumstances. That's your stats lesson, okay? But you don't have to crunch these numbers. You all have really smart people in your organisation that can do that for you. But the bit you do need to do is before you do Geronimo and jump in and solve a problem and implement a really good strategy, the thing you need to do is pause and say, could we test this in an evidence-based way? Otherwise, whatever the results are, you won't ever know. And sorry to tell you this, and I'm going to be a bit blunt here. Your great idea that may have actually had a real impact will very quickly drift off and be relegated to the large policing scrap heap of unknown policing strategies. And you'll very soon be on to the next crisis, doing it all over again. But if for the right problem, at the right time, with the right collaboration and support, you decide to adopt an evidence-based approach, you'll be able to show what works, you'll be able to find out things you didn't even know, and you'll be able to add to the body of knowledge of policing, and in doing so, the professionalism of policing. And I can tell you this, police, including senior police, will want to hear about it. And I'm not saying it's easy or that you should do this all the time, but what I am saying is that policing does need more rigour and science. And there are questions that we don't know the answers to, that we do need to answer in the interests of public safety. And we need to advance knowledge in policing, and EBP is the vehicle to do that. Now, I'm going to finish, but I am going to, you'll recall I started with something abstract. I'm going to finish with something equally as abstract and non-police related. And I'm going to turn to history to give us some inspiration for evidence-based policing. And it goes to the theme of this conference, leadership, legitimacy and the role of evidence. So here we go. I'll take you back to the age of sail, where Spain, France, and the British Empire were fighting it out on the seas. Sailing an 18th century warship required many men. Anticipating some would die from scurvy, captains took along extra men, but the losses often exceeded the expectations. And during the age of sail, approximately 2 million men died from scurvy, more than all the fighting, more than all the storms and shipwrecks combined. And in the 7-Year War, a sailor was less than 1% likely to be killed in conflict and 73% likely to die from scurvy. And everyone had their own crackpot idea as to how to cure it. In 1753, James Lind, a ship's surgeon, ran a remarkable experiment. He picked 12 sailors and put them into pairs. He tested the pairs on vinegar, cider, and sulfuric acid, seawater, and horseradish. The sixth group received 2 oranges and a lemon. The remarkable thing I want you to take away from Lind is not the sudden and visible effects of vitamin C in curing scurvy. What I want you to take away from Lind is that he trialled an approach contrary to accepted tradition set by the authority of the British Navy. can I suggest to you that challenging the convention and authority of the British Navy would not have been easy, and nor is it for you and I in our positions. I also want you to take away from Lind is that what he did operationally would have been extremely difficult. Imagine trying to convince a sick sailor on a ship at sea to drink seawater. He also persevered in implementing his findings over many years. The trial was run in 1763, and it wasn't until 1795 that health authorities persuaded the British Navy to adopt citrus as a cure for scurvy, which ultimately resulted in them defeating the Spanish Navy and saving the British Empire. Challenging convention, even with good evidence, is hard, and there is a convenient and comfortable ignorance that some people enjoy. And it's been said that loss aversion or change is a powerful conservative force favouring the status quo. And just because it works doesn't mean that policymakers are going to adopt it or street level bureaucrats are going to embrace it. So it's not all about the evidence. The approach adopted by the Evidence-Based Policing Centre in New Zealand is based on the creation of a healthy tension between three disciplines: strategic intent, evidence, and experience. And I think that's a pretty good approach. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Think about an aspiration you have in policing to make a difference for a group of people, for your community, for the disadvantaged, for victims, or even for the profession of policing itself. And then compare your aspiration to the current reality. That gap between the current reality and your aspiration is your opportunity to lead important evidence-based work that will make a difference, because the world needs you and I to do that more often than we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that informative presentation, and particularly some of the points that you made, just the conclusion of your presentation. We don't want policing to wait 40 years to adopt EBP, like the British Navy did to adopt lime juice. And also those words around aspiration. Think about the aspiration and compare it to the reality and the gap that exists. We really appreciate those final words. I hope you don't mind. We've got a couple of questions that have come in for you, Dave. We'd like to put those to you now, if that's okay. Our first one comes from Nicholas. Thank you, Nicholas, for your question. Nicholas asks, EBP is great. However, caseload constraints for each officer will impact the amount of time dedicated to EBP. How do you suggest we achieve an effective balance, Dave?
Look, EBP is not about making it harder for police. It's about making it easier for police. And as I suggested in my presentation, there are a lot of questions that are unanswered, and there are a lot of activities that police undertake that we really don't know whether they work. So I wouldn't be alarmed about burdening police with additional work. In fact, we want to be more effective, and we have an obligation to the community to do what works, and we need to continue the quest of knowledge and learning. So that's probably how I'd sum that up.
Thank you, Dave, for that response. One more. You mentioned Google Scholar during your presentation. Are there any other databases that police can access? This question comes from someone watching now. I believe the Global Policing Database, or GPD, hosted by the University of Queensland, is an excellent source of published and grey literature.
That's true, and as I suggested, we're doing a lot of work to pull together all those studies with the University of Queensland. The UK government funded the What Works Centre for Crime Prevention, so you can put that into Google, and that is designed for police, and you can jump into there and look across a whole range of policing strategies, and they summarise things very neatly for police. But yes, even the simple search in Google Scholar, you'll have to sift through a lot, but you're not just searching shopping and everything else. You are searching published papers, and a lot of places aren't even aware of the fact that they can jump into Google Scholar and undertake those searches. And if you've got a challenge, I would suggest looking broadly at the literature, and as well as if you do know anyone in academia using them, because what I've found is that academics are incredibly generous in their time in working with police. So I think continuing to explore new ways is probably the most important thing we can do.
ANZSEBP President Dave Cowan, thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.